Alright, good stuff. So, for our beer and movie pairing, we are doing the Samuel Smith Teddy Porter. I wanted to find a movie that was set in England, roughly the same time as the Industrial Revolution, as that's when English Porter really came into its own. I was thinking about breaking out some stuffy Charles Dickens adaptation, but that didn't feel right to me for whatever reason. I wanted something darker. Not that Dickens isn't dark, he's pretty fucking bleak, but he's not the right kind of dark, you know? That's what led me to Mary Shelley and her best known work of incest and suicide, Matilda. No, dummy, I'm talking about Frankenstein. I couldn't even name another Mary Shelley story. I had to look that shit up. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, in 1818, just 1 year after Daniel Wheeler patented his black patent malting drum, as it happens. The first edition was published anonymously. The second edition, released in 1823, was the first to feature her name. It is capital G Gothic and capital R Romantic, and Shelley began writing it when she was just 18 years old, with it being published when she was 20. Director Guillermo del Toro, who absolutely loves monster stories, called it a quintessential teenage book, saying of the story themes, "You don't belong, you are brought to this world by people that don't care for you, and you are thrown into a world of pain and suffering, and tears and hunger. It's an amazing book, written by a teenage girl. It's mind-blowing." And it really is. There have been numerous adaptations of Mary Shelley's novel, the most famous one, of course, being Universal's Boris Karloff version. Those are great movies, Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, that is, both directed by James Whale, and between the two of them, they cover a good amount of the book's story. I think the Frankenstein movie that incorporates more of the book than any others is the Kenneth Branagh one from 1994, called Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But while it may have a lot of the same plot as the book, including the Arctic expedition plot that frames the book's greater narrative, it is a real mess of a movie. It's big and loud, without any subtlety whatsoever, which would be fine if it was scary in any way, but it's not. I'm not sure what Branagh was going for, but the whole thing just comes off as overwrought and silly. But not fun silly, you know, like you might expect from a movie with John Cleese in a supporting role, but dumb silly, like you would expect from a bland horror movie made in the mid-90s. Frank Darabont, the movie screenwriter, called it the best script I ever wrote and the worst movie I've ever seen. Sick burn, Frank. So, on the scale of Frankenstein movies, with the top being the Universal ones and the bottom probably being that I Frankenstein shit that briefly tanked Aaron Eckhart's career, the movie we're talking about today is definitely towards the top. It's not the best, but there are so many trash Frankenstein movies out there that this one has to be better than most. It's The Curse of Frankenstein from Hammer Films, released in 1957 and starring the Hammer Films All-Stars, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Now, if you're not familiar, Hammer Films, it's a British production company that's best known for making gothic horror films from the late 50s into the 70s. Hammer dominated the horror market for years, and they did so largely by reimagining the classic Universal monsters of the 20s and 30s. They brought these classic monsters back to the screen in vivid color, and with just enough tweaking to avoid any legal action on the part of Universal. The success of The Curse of Frankenstein is a big reason why Hammer made so many horror movies. Before that, they didn't really do any horror movies. They mostly made thrillers and crime films. It was originally conceived as like a black and white quickie, made for cheap and released with little fanfare. But thanks to a fortuitous rewrite, Hammer instead chose to put some money into the movie and shoot it in color. It was a gamble that paid off handsomely, as Curse was a resounding success that made Hammer Films synonymous with horror. It did much the same for its two stars, Cushing and Lee, who also starred in Hammer-produced movies about Dracula, The Abominable Snowman, The Devil, The Mummy, The Gorgon, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, even Rasputin. Like, they were horror icons through the 60s. So, yeah, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee are a big part of what makes The Curse of Frankenstein work. Most of the heavy lifting is done by Cushing as Victor Frankenstein. His performance is fantastically perverse. He is betrothed to his young cousin, which, gross. But that doesn't stop him from banging his live-in maid and leading her to believe that he'll marry her one day. And that's all before he starts figuring out how to resurrect dead creatures through galvanism. Once that starts, he really turns into a sadistic prick. He steals a corpse. He cuts off the hands of a recently deceased sculptor to put on the corpse. He then kills a professor to get to his brain. His tutor, Paul, confronts him about all the schoolish behavior, and the two academics get into a dainty little fight that ends with the brain getting damaged. But, Frankenstein doesn't have another brain he deems worthy of his new creation, so he picks the biggest bits of glass out of it and pops it into the corpse's head. He's off the deep end at this point, so there's nothing that can stop him from pushing ahead with this morbid plan. His plan works, obviously, and that finally brings Christopher Lee into the movie. Whereas Peter Cushing is the clear villain of the movie, Lee's creature is not much better. He isn't going for sympathetic, he's going for monstrous. He's just full of primal rage, which leads to him being killed more than once. The makeup effects for the creature are solid for the time, and they're especially impressive when you learn that they were made up on the fly on the first day of shooting, because there was concern that the original makeup was too close to the Universal version. The blood effects really pop too. That's what I remember the most from watching horror movies as a child. The blood is really thick and really red. It doesn't look anything like real blood, but for an audience raised on black and white movies, I'm sure that vivid red was really incendiary. And the movie was a huge success. Watching it through the lens of today, it's not scary at all, and the gore effects are tame, and the sets are stagey, and the secondary characters are one-dimensional, but it has solid lead performances, and vivid colors, as I mentioned, and moodiness to spare, and this movie absolutely blew the lid off the horror genre back in the day. It was a revolutionary film. So that's why it's such a good pairing for an English porter. The movie changed the way people made horror films, just as porters changed the way brewers made beer. Porters are dark, with tinges of red at the edges. That's a perfect description for The Curse of Frankenstein. They're both things that were essential for moving things forward in their respective fields. But today, they don't have the relevance they once did. They are relics of a sort, but they're relics that still have things to teach us. They're worth seeking out because of their ties to history. Samuel Smith's Old Brewery Taddy Porter is very much a historical beer, even if it was reintroduced in 1979. It is made with well water and fermented in Yorkshire squares. Over the years, any number of materials were used to make fermentation vessels. Oak vats were the most common back in the day, but now most vessels are made from stainless steel. A Yorkshire square, though, is made from stone. Sam Smith is one of the few remaining breweries to use the Yorkshire square, and their yeast is from a strain that has been used continuously for over 100 years. Not only that, but they still make local beer deliveries using Grey Shire horses in and around Tadcaster. They know how important history is to their brand. And that's part of what makes learning about these old school beer styles so much fun. There's been so much advancement in terms of the brewing technology and the availability of materials and ways to regulate what goes on during the brewing process. But despite all that, there are still breweries out there who are doing things much the same way they were 100 or so years ago. They've been making consistently great beer for that long, using methods that predate sliced bread. I think that's very cool. You know what else is cool? When you reach out to me on social media. How's that for a fucking segue? Hit me up on the social meds, as the kids might say. They don't say that. If I, a middle-aged white man, if I say it, that means the kids are definitely not saying it anymore. And let's be honest, they probably never were. But don't let that stop you from hitting me up on Twitter or Facebook or what have you. I hear good things about MySpace. I'll get around to that one soon, hopefully. But until then, just look for me at Beer Blockbuster, and you'll find me somewhere. And if you don't do social media, don't worry about it, because I'll be back with another thrilling, exciting, bombastic episode of Beer Barrels and Blockbusters very soon. Until then, good night, nerds.